What a fantastic
Welcome.
introduction. Thank you, Tanya. Actually, can I just ask you, do you think Marx is a goodie or a baddie? To be discussed.
Yeah, I just think depend what you're talking about. I think is a system which he introduced, the socialism, basically taking the Torah ethical and moral teachings and introducing it out of the religious context. I think it was good. You know, I grew up in the communist, but because I saw the other end of the stick and how it can be, what is the word, abused.
Yes.
So that wasn't really good. But also the way he kind of prompted a different attitude towards capitalists. At the same time, we as Jewish people suffered a lot from that. So it's quite interesting. He's quite, I think, probably controversial person for us as Jewish people.
He is. There are some really good bits about him, which I'm going to try to bring out, which I'm not sure generally people know, although chip in if you think I'm wrong on this. But there's also some very problematic parts of him. So what I'm going to be doing today is I'll take you through his life, and then I'm going to tackle 2 or 3 aspects. I want to understand what he meant by communism. So what were his economics, and do they have relevance today? I'll also be talking about what he overtly said about Judaism and religion. And then I'll be picking on a point which Tanya brought out, whether his approach is driven from Judaism. Is it consistent with Judaism? So hopefully that will be an interesting hour or so. Let me just start off. He was 19th century. So the very similar time to those Rothschilds that we talked about last week. And they kind of are opposites, aren't they? So the Rothschilds were making money. Marx never made money. Marx felt that money was evil. And I thought it'd be really interesting to get that counterpoint. But they were facing the same struggles, I suppose, that Jews were facing in that time. So he was just after Napoleonic Wars. So Napoleon had come in, opened up Europe to Jews. You're free, you can do what you like. It had all been closed down again in what is now Germany. So they were suffering huge discrimination. Massive economic change going on. There was the Industrial Revolution. There were the 1848 revolutions. It was a time of real turmoil. And capitalism was very raw in those days. So you had economic cycles, busts and booms, much more so than we have today, when government steps in to really rescue the situation quite often, like it did with COVID. So interestingly, inflation is going to really take off in the next few months. How much will the government do to help us? 19th century, it would have done nothing, and thousands would have starved, as they did in Ireland, for example. So we're not in a raw capitalist system, which he was, and which he was so opposed to. Okay, so what I'm going to do is share a PowerPoint, which I have, which will, let me just, oh, I'm already screen sharing. Oh, that's very spectacular. It's working already set up, is that right? Oh, perfect. I didn't do anything. Wonderful, thank you.
We have a tech guru in this.
Oh, yeah, absolutely. Right, so who was Marx? So Marx was a philosopher, an economist, a journalist, a revolutionary thinker. So he's one of the most influential figures in human history, whose work has been passionately extolled and violently denigrated. Black and white character. I think he's the most controversial Jew of modern times and the most misunderstood. So in my mind, he's quite like Jesus. So Jesus said things 2,000 years ago, which Paul completely changed and misinterpreted, in my view. Marx, very similar with Engels in this case, and other people, Lenin and so forth. But nonetheless, he was the driver, the impetus behind massive social upheaval, behind revolution, behind tyranny. So he was disastrously misinterpreted, however. He really wanted a peaceful transition of power to the workers through political agitation, not violent revolution. And I think this is, yeah, here we've got a couple of statues of him. This is in Shanghai and in Moscow. So he really is, you know, a hugely important figure. He was energetic, impractical, passionate, self-confident, intellectually brilliant, an idealistic, radical, big thinker who was a master of rhetorical prose and the cutting comment. So he's one of the principal architects of what we now call modern sociology and the chief theoretician of socialism. He particularly was keen to identify the dehumanizing weaknesses of capitalism, especially the curse of alienation. So that's a word I'll talk about a lot today. He inspired a global devotion, really. He became a virtual secular god in Soviet Russia, where his writings became the sort of source of truth and authority. So at its peak, nearly half the world's population were ruled by leaders who claimed to be Marxist. What was driving him was to harmonize conflicting human interests, this free and equal society. And he had a sort of messianic zeal to create this utopia that's going to be fair for all. And the practical details of all this, however, were pretty vague. Now, obviously, that last sentence about how this messianic idea about a utopian system, this is very consistent with the prophets. That's what they wanted to do. And so whether he acknowledged it or not, he is driven by their vision, I think, as I'll try and bring out. However, he was pretty ignorant about the rituals and beliefs of Judaism. And perhaps because he was ignorant, he violently denigrated it, and he did, as Tanya mentioned, really encourage anti-Semitism. He was always an outsider. He was estranged from his family, from his religion, from his class, from his country. He didn't die a happy man. Okay, so that's a summary. Let me go back now and take you through his life story before I talk about what he said. So he was born in this house, which is in Trier, in Prussia, on the 5th of May, 1818. His father was Herschel and his mother Henrietta. He was the third of 9 children, although he became the eldest son in 1819. And his maternal grandfather was a Dutch rabbi. His father's family had been rabbis of Trier since 1723, so it was in the tradition. And so his uncle was chief rabbi of Trier until he died in 1827. Now, 1812, I mentioned, after Napoleon was defeated, an edict was passed prohibiting Jews from holding public office or practicing a profession in Prussia. Herschel was a lawyer, and he wanted to carry on doing law, so he converted to Lutheranism in 1817. That was kind of unusual, by the way, because in this part of Germany it was Catholicism, so he was kind of rebel. A rebel, that's right. He wasn't a true convert. He was only doing it as a means to an end. He became known as Heinrich, and he lived a comfortable middle-class existence. He owned a number of vineyards in Moselle. He was a man of the Enlightenment, a bourgeois liberal. So he was interested in the ideas of Kant and Voltaire. Henrietta, there was no economic reason for her to convert, so she postponed it until her father died in 1825, and that's when Marx, aged 6, was also baptized. About the same time as Disraeli, by the way, so it was a common thing across Europe, really. It was a way to have a full freedom in the society. He was confirmed when he was 15, but he had no religious education in any religion, and he never sought to acquire any. He was taught at home until age 12, when he went to Trier High School, which employed many liberal humanists. And then in 36, he went to University of Bonn to study philosophy and literature. Now, his father insisted, in short measure, that he change to law, as that was a much more useful way of earning a living. He got poor grades, however. He was imprisoned for brawling whilst drunk, and was actually slightly wounded in a duel. So very bourgeois. And his father quickly tired of this wild rampaging, as he called it, and transferred him to the more academic University of Berlin. He carried on living an indulgent life there too, and due to his weak chest, he was excused military service. In 1936, he also became engaged to Jenny von Westphalen. So she was a beautiful, educated, free thinker, really from the Prussian ruling class, who had known Marx in childhood. And Marx was a friend of her father, Ludwig, and in fact dedicated his doctoral thesis to him. But Ludwig opposed their relationship, perhaps because of Jewish past, perhaps because he was more up in society. I think Marx was also a bit of a yobbo, really. Marx maintained a close relationship with his own father until he died from tuberculosis in 1837, when he was aged 57. Marx, however, didn't attend his funeral. He kind of cut off his relationships with his family at that point. He said it was a long journey from Berlin, it wasn't worth his while. He had nothing in common with his mother, who, despite being the rabbi's daughter, was illiterate. She had no education whatsoever. He had little to do with her, especially as she blocked him from receiving his father's money, which he felt was his right. So he moved on from his family. He wasn't close to any of his siblings either, never writes about them or anything. He got his law degree in 1838 and then became enthralled with this guy and Hegelian philosophy, and the idea of revolution as a way to overcome entrenched privilege and tradition. Hegel came up with this idea of having a thesis and then an antithesis, which leads to a synthesis. And that's the model that he's going to use all the way through. So he completed his doctoral thesis on why theology was inferior to philosophy, which is an interesting topic. He did that in 1841. And he was destined to have an academic career. But this was blocked by the government's growing opposition to liberalism and revolutionary thoughts. So, desperate for money, he turned to journalism. He had some debts he had to deal with, and he moved to Cologne, where he wrote for this newly founded radical newspaper, Die Rheinische Zeitung. Now, his articles were extreme. They were dripped with political sarcasm, and they criticized both the right-wing ruling class and the ineffective figures in the liberal and socialist movements. And when the acting editor, Moses Hess, who you might have heard of, one of the very early Zionists actually, a very interesting history he's got, when he resigned, Marx replaced him. Now, it wasn't an explicitly revolutionary paper, but the government censored his articles and they closed the paper down entirely in 1843. This is a cartoon which was published at the time of Marx as Prometheus. So this is his liver being eaten each day, going back to the Greek myth. And what's eating it is a Prussian eagle, so it's kind of trying to give that impression. And when the paper was closed down, he said, it is a bad thing to have to perform menial duties, even for the sake of freedom. To fight with pinpricks instead of with clubs. I've become tired of hypocrisy and stupidity and gross arbitrariness, and of our bowing and scraping and dodging and hair-splitting over words. Consequently, the government has given me back my freedom. So, and this, I think, is very typical of this hot-headed idealist, really. Now, 7 years have passed since he got engaged, and her father just died, so Marx and Jenny married in a Protestant church in Bad Kreuznach in 1843, and their relationship was great. Unlike many of the people I talk about, actually, who had a fractured relationship, theirs was deep and romantic. They shared very similar political beliefs, and they were intellectual companions, and she could interpret his handwriting, so he needed her to write out his notes. They had 7 children, only 3 survived into childhood, and they all ended tragically, unfortunately. I'll talk about that a bit later. While on an extended honeymoon, he wrote a critical study called The Critique of Hegel's Philosophy of Right, and this was really the start of his socialist ideas. He was feted by his peers at this stage. He was charismatic and brilliant intellectually, and that meant really that he was their natural leader. But he was also arrogant. So he kind of would forensically criticize other left-wing thinkers, which helped to develop his theories, but it also made him many enemies. He moved to Paris in 1843 because there was open discussion of revolution happening there, and he became co-editor of a new radical left-wing newspaper called Deutsche Französische Jahrbucher. And for this paper, he wrote this famous thing, which is called On the Jewish Question. Now, actually, the most famous part of this is that it introduced the idea that the proletariat could be a revolutionary force. And it actually marked his formal acceptance of communism. I will touch on what he said about Jews a bit later. The Prussian government issued a warrant for the arrest of the editors, so Marx couldn't return to Germany. So instead, he stayed in France, intensively studying economics and socialism. And on the 28th of August, 1844, he had his road to Damascus experience. He met this guy, Friedrich Engels, who was a German socialist, again, a bourgeois. He owned factories and all sorts, but they talked, according to the Bulwer books, for 10 days non-stop. And that culminated in a pledge of undying friendship. They were intellectual soulmates. Engels showed Marx the book he'd just written, The Condition of the Working Class in England, in 1844, which convinced Marx that workers should be the agent of the final revolution in history. Marx probably hadn't met any workers at this point. He was a theoretician, but that's why Engels was so important to him. And Engels had only met them by being their boss as well. So it was, you know. So Marx was this erudite author and theorist. Engels had some practical knowledge. And together they visited the Chartists in Manchester, who were trying to foment some sort of revolution in England, and they didn't really get anywhere really. Okay, subsequent to this, Engels kind of acted like a substitute mother to Marx, really. He would be looking after or fussing over his health, chivvying him to finish his books, and frequently sent him money, basically supported him financially. Marx wrote an article mocking the Prussian king, and so Prussia pressured France to expel him. And he lived in Brussels for a few years, associating with other socialists. To avoid extradition to Prussia and what that would entail, he renounced his Prussian citizenship, and thereafter he was stateless for the rest of his life. However, he did attend the initial conference of the newly formed Communist League in 1847, which was held, where would you think it would be held, this conference? In London, of all places. Not because it was a revolutionary place, but because everyone else would outlaw it there. So London was the place to come if you nowhere else would take you. You didn't need billions of Russian rubles at that point. So at this conference, they debated fiercely how communism would come about. There were many different groups trying to do this, really. And at the end of the conference, the chair or the committee said to him and Engels, would you kind of write up what our decisions are? And in 2 weeks, they wrote the most influential pamphlet of all time, the 30-page manifesto of the Communist Party. or the Communist Manifesto as we know of it. Now, it's 1848. There's masses of revolutions going on in Europe at this time. This manifesto makes not the slightest impact on any of this. It's barely noticed. It was published anonymously. It only became famous after Marx died. It's a rewriting of history is going on here, really. He did support the revolutions, although he didn't think that's how they should come about, because it wasn't an uprising of the people. So because he supported them over, he was expelled to Belgium. He moved back to Cologne, trying to encourage the bourgeoisie to overthrow the aristocracy. And with Engels, he started a radical revolutionary newspaper. But he was harassed and prosecuted by the police. And when the democratic parliament in Prussia collapsed, the reactionary government, which took over, came through and moved against the radicals really fiercely. So he was expelled from the country, and this is when he moved to London in 1849. And he stayed here as a political exile for the rest of his life. And he was never again involved in direct revolutionary activity. Instead, he lived in dire poverty. Oh, that's the newspaper, isn't it? Sorry. He lived in dire poverty here, in two small rooms in Soho. This is Dean Street, just, in Soho. Dependent on Engels' financial support. He had to borrow money to pay for the funeral of one of his children, for example. And another time he pawned his coat. He was destitute. But he actually did have money, he just spent it ridiculously. He had a servant, for goodness sake. It's, for 10 years, he was the European correspondent of the New York Daily Tribune, which at the time had the highest circulation in the world of 200,000 copies. And in 1856, Jenny got 2 inheritances, which enabled them to move to an 8-room house near Hampstead Heath. So they basically found themselves a bourgeois situation to live in. But the repeated failures of all these revolutions on the continent depressed him, and he kind of retreated into doing isolated research, studying 9 to 7 p.m. here in the reading room of the British Museum. He analysed government data looking for evidence of capitalist corruption. And his most productive period was probably about 1858, as he thought that the economic depression of the time would mean the revolution was just about to come, and he was worried that his ideas would be overtaken by events. He predicted revolution 30 times, never actually happened. So he was the foremost socialist intellectual of the time, but he wasn't a political leader. He didn't have an organised movement behind him. He was involved in the General Council of the First International in 1864 and helped to draft its inaugural address. And then after 20 years procrastination, he published the first volume of this book, Das Kapital, in 1867. Has anyone even looked at it here? You may have heard of it. No.
Heard about it.
Very few people have. It's long, it's complex, it's difficult to understand. Marx's friends were enthusiastic, but wider recognition was very slow in coming. It now, I suppose, within Russia, it's a canonical text, or it was. And it does provide a theoretical foundation to critique capitalism, but it's seldom read, really. He did have some more political activities. He backed the Prussians initially in the Franco-Prussian War in 1870, but then gained notoriety for an address to the International at the Paris Commune in 1871. And that aroused suspicion of an international communist conspiracy. So he'd initially opposed the insurrection, but his opponent said he was involved with it, so he effectively became involved with the commune. They forged letters to substantiate their claims, and he became famous as an international revolutionary, supposedly masterminding a worldwide socialist conspiracy. And he said, "I have the honour of being at this moment the most vilified and most menaced man in London." This really does one good after a tedious 20-year evil in my den. He hadn't done anything to do this, really. It's a joke. Last decade of his life, his health declined. He was living a comfortable middle-class life, benefiting from inheritances. He liked drinking and smoking cigars. He moved to a large house in Chalk Farm. This is it now, in Maitland Park Road. It's the unique, I think, it's the only house in London where the owners have asked for the blue plaque to be removed. So he moved there. What else? Oh yeah, he sent his children to a ladies' seminary. He visited fashionable continental spas. So he wasn't your usual revolutionary, was he really? This is a picture of himself, Marx on the left, Engels on the right, and his kids. Laura, Eleanor, and Jenny. And he was a concerned and caring parent. These two elder daughters, Jenny and Laura, they both married men involved in the socialist movement. None of Laura's children survived beyond 3. Jenny's firstborn also died in infancy, but 4 did survive. From his 20s, he suffered from really poor ill health, including carbuncles, which, by the way, Rothschild also had carbuncles. He died of his carbuncles. There's a nice link between the two. And these severely incapacitated him. He had numerous stomach complaints and coughs and vomiting and hemorrhages, which made it difficult to talk and swallow. Eventually, he suffered partial paralysis, loss of memory. And in December 1881, his wife, Jenny, died from cancer, having been unwell for many years. He was too ill to go to the funeral. And then tragically, his daughter, Jenny, also died from cancer just a couple of years later. She was just 40. And he basically never got over these losses. So he died 14th of March, 1883, aged 64, bronchitis. He died in Hampstead, and he's buried at Highgate. You might have been there. Only 11 mourners went to the funeral, Engels one of them, and it was at this point that he started to create the myth of Marx, really. He said his name will endure through the ages. Well, he was, yeah, and he made that happen, but it's due to Engels. And on the epitaph of the grave is the phrase, "The philosophers have only interpreted the world in various ways. The point, however, is to change it," as any good prophet would agree with. Okay, so let me try and sum up what he was like. Well, doesn't really come across here. I haven't got any pictures really of him young. He had this dark complexion, deep black hair and beard, which obviously he has turned white. His visual presence inspired people and intimidated others into silence. He had a lisp, and his gruff accent often led to misunderstandings. So he was more effective in writing than when speaking. He was absent-minded, disorganized, impulsive, impractical. He had a chaotic lifestyle. He was virtually unemployable. He never had a steady income, and he lived in debt for most of his life. I guess that comes from your ancestors being rabbis, is that right, Theo? You don't know. He procrastinated until deadlines loomed, when he worked feverishly through the night. He was most productive when he had been motivated by a sort of seething fury, usually at some half-wit who dared to challenge him. He was an optimist, always believed in the redemptive future. Proud and arrogant, courageous, reckless, a man of natural authority. His will was indomitable. He never gave up, really, but he had to control things, and he had his way of doing it. He was pretty inflexible. He was revolutionary in thought, but thoroughly bourgeois. In male company, he enjoyed dirty jokes. He gossiped about titillating sexual scandals. He was gregarious and convivial. He loved to go on pub crawls and be the centre of attention, and he frequently got into physical scrapes. But in mixed company, he was chivalrous and gentlemanly. Easily irritated, he quickly denounced colleagues as being ideologically suspect, and he fell out with many friends. He took offence easily and bore petty grudges for years. Intellectually intimidating, he delighted in insulting people he disagreed with. And he wielded his pen like a dagger, really. So this vindictiveness, this brooding rage, this lack of tact, meant he spent most of his adult life in exile and isolation. So he was an angry agitator who achieved little in his lifetime. So that's Marx the person, not Marxism. We'll come to that in a second, and his views on Judaism. But I don't know if anybody's got any questions about him as an individual before we go on to what he actually wrote about and what he said.
There's messages on
Oh, there's some messages. Okay, I'll check the chat. Thank you. I am not keen on the music while we wait. Oh, okay. But at least I know you're getting sound this week. Okay, good. I hope you're more interested in what I've been saying. Good. Any questions anyone's got?
It's just fascinating. I'm still kind of processing, really. I probably didn't expect all that.
Yeah, I know. I wanted to give you a feeling for the man.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
Because it's just, I'm really an occupational psychologist. I try to understand what they're really all about. And I think you can help understand what they're trying to write as well, if you know the person.
I wouldn't have expected him to lead like a bourgeois life. That's why I didn't know it. I wouldn't have expected it.
Yeah. A myth has grown up around him, really, as to what he was like.
Did you see that? I think it was called Young Marx. There was a play a few years ago that was in London.
Yeah.
And they portrayed him, they showed him like living in poverty in London. It doesn't sound like from what you said.
No, he didn't.
Until he inherited.
Yeah, he was, didn't he?
Well, maybe those days hamster wasn't the desirable.
But when he first was there, he couldn't spend, money frittered away from him. He had £250 as an allowance, which is a lot. It's a middle class allowance, but he just couldn't look after it well. So.
Well, I guess if you like to go on a pub crawls.
Yes, exactly. His house was kind of an open house as well, so all the waifs and strays came, and that sort of stuff.
Since he was converted, followed no religious practice whatsoever, why was he regarded as a Jew?
Well, you're halakhically a Jew.
Oh, just from the halakha.
Yeah, well, but also Disraeli was always a Jew.
Yes.
Yeah,
You're
that's
born
right.
from it, and you never get rid of the stigma.
Yeah, that's right.
Really, in his eyes, that's
right.
So actually, although he gave a lot of anti-Semitism, you could argue, he received a lot as well. As I will touch on this going forward. Yeah.
Michael Watson online has a question.
Okay.
Michael, would you like to unmute?
Yes. Michael, have you you've raised your hand.
Yes.
Oh,
Can I ask a question?
yes, please do.
You said you and Rabbi Tanya have drawn a comparison between what he did and the Bible. I mean, you said he was driven by the prophets. But on the other hand, you also said that he had very little religious background knowledge. How do these compare?
Yes, you'll have to stay for the next half, or I'm going to explain all that. Thank you, Mike. That's a brilliant lead-in. Before I get to the Jewish bit, which is the pièce de résistance, I want to talk about Marxism, which is really the economic side of him, actually. So let me move on to that. Now, I have to say that Marxist thought was really created by... I need to click here, probably do to get it to move on. Yes. Marxist thought is more to do with Engels than Marx. He selectively edited Marx's work, and he's created this Marxist orthodoxy. So he's presenting Marxist thinking as a closed theoretical system, sometimes elevating casual comments on current affairs into eternal truths. And that really wasn't Marx, but nonetheless, I'm going to try to explain it. And hopefully I'm not going to make it too complicated, but if I do, I'll try not to. Okay, so some key concepts of Marxism I want to bring out. One core thing is that actually life goes on, or economics goes on, in a necessary set of stages, which you can't do anything about to avoid. So that the way that economists organize themselves is really crucial, whether you're in a state of slavery and feudalism or capitalism. For most of history, there have been haves and have-nots, just different haves and have-nots. It's only what he called primitive communism, when we were in the jungle or wherever we were, or at the final stage, ultimate communism, where we will get rid of that. And essentially, this haves and have-not is the biggest evil which he saw. And arguably, you can say it's the biggest evil still within capitalism. The inequalities of wealth and income that we've got is increasing in some economies, particularly Britain and America, and could well lead to all sorts of social problems going forward. So that's one key concept. Haves and have-nots, stages in history, we can't do anything about it. It inevitably will follow. Another one is that the bourgeoisie are controlling the proletariat. The class struggle is crucial to understanding how societies are. What this means is a conflict between the ruling classes, the bourgeoisie, who control the means of production, and the working classes, the proletariat, who sell their labour for wages. So the property-owning classes are in inevitable conflict, and what's more, states are run for the benefit of the ruling classes. They're falsely represented as saying, hey, we're in the common interest, but no, it's the rulers will definitely do it. We have benevolent capitalism in the 19th centuries where the rich would give money to it, but essentially he would say, no, it's the ruling classes who are in the House of Lords and the House of Commons, and they're determining how things are. And the proletariat are too weak to do anything about that. Now, capitalism is the most powerful stage of economic development. It's driven by the globalized market, and that eventually becomes stronger than any country. You can see that today, Facebook or Google, it's arguably stronger than any country or many countries. And capitalism is associated with destructive values. I've got some here. So exploitation or alienation or domination. This is inherent within the capitalist system. So you get competitiveness. It evokes anxiety in people, conformism and so forth. It treats workers as expendable. They're not individuals with their own rights. They're slaves, effectively. And people hate the insecurity and vulnerability within capitalism. So if technological developments happen and a factory is closed down or a mine is closed, people are left helpless. And that's not good for people's psyche. What's more, there's a concept of, he's called it surplus value. So labour produces excess. It works, you'll pay for it, but it produces more than it's paid for. And the difference is profit. And that represents the exploitation of workers by their employers. And inevitably, capital gets more share of national income at the expense of workers. It's theft, it's exploitation. This inequality leads to dissatisfaction as people measure their own worth relative to others. So it makes capitalism very fragile. And that's worsened because you have a cycle going on of boom and bust, effectively. Capitalism produces more than it can be consumed, and that causes contraction. So actually crises are caused by abundance rather than shortage. And that produces an opportunity this provides an opportunity for capitalist economists to produce all that societies need, so that people don't need to work so hard. But as you know, we do. We just get to the grindstone and we work longer and longer hours. So we're caught, we're like a hamster on the wheel. Now, Marx's approach would be, let me read this to you. Work is external to the worker. It is not part of his nature. Work's not a good thing. Consequently, he does not fulfill himself in his work, but denies himself. The worker feels himself at home only during his leisure time, whereas at work he feels homeless. So he yearned for a free society where people transcend their alienation from work and can get a sense of connection. They do what they want to do rather than what they're forced to do. Leisure's good. We think of unemployment as bad. You're missing something, the whole word unemployment. But why? I'm living a life of Riley, I don't work. So we should consider it as a mark of freedom. And this should be funded by distributing profits equally. People can work a lot less. So Marx wanted people to be free of financial restraints so they could make genuine choices about how they wanted to live their lives. And he was opposed also to materialism, the dominance of money as a measure of well-being. You should measure your worth differently. So gross national product wouldn't have been the measure for him. There's a lot we can agree with, clearly, in Marx's thought with this. Now, I mentioned he wrote the Communist Manifesto. So how does this start? Like this. This is a famous start of it. A spectre is haunting Europe, the spectre of communism. All the powers of old Europe have entered into a holy alliance to exorcise this spectre. The history of all hitherto existing society is the history of class struggles. Freeman and slave, patrician and plebeian, lord and serf, guild master and journeyman, in a word, oppressor and oppressed. They stood in constant opposition to one another, carried on uninterrupted, sometimes hidden, sometimes in open fight, a fight that each time ended either in a revolutionary reconstitution of society or in the common ruin of the contending classes. So at the very centre is this conflict which is inevitable. And he wanted to create what he called the dictatorship of the proletariat. What was his ideal society, which has got 10 points. Any good plan's got 10 points in it? These are his 10 points. Now, the point about them is they're not ultra-revolutionary. It's not what Russia did in 1917, excuse me. There are some elements which are very radical. So he wants to abolish private land ownership and abolish rights to inheritance and so forth, because this is a source of inequality. He wants them to be communally owned, like a kibbutz, for example. Heavy progressive income tax is, lots of societies do that. That would be similar to in Sweden or Norway. Confiscate property of emigrants. So this is if you can't sell up and move out of this society and take your money with you. The banks, because they're so crucial, they need to be nationalised like we did in the 2008 crisis. Communication and railways also, because you definitely need those. Have more factories owned by state, but there can be factories owned by people. Everyone has to work, so you can't just have a leisured class. Get rid of distinction between agriculture and manufacturing, this us and them, and then universal free education, abolish child labour, some we would definitely clearly agree with. Radical, but not hugely revolutionary, I think. Class struggles, therefore, will eventually lead to the toppling of capitalism and the creation of this communist society once the market and all class divisions have been abolished. And the manifesto ends with this famous phrase: the proletarians have nothing to lose but their chains. They have a world to win. Working men of all countries unite. Now, these theories that he put together, they are speculative. They are not based on detailed factual studies. and on many things he was historically wrong. So, about the demise of capitalism. So, doomsday did not arrive. Wages have not fallen to subsistence levels, the rate of profit has not declined, economic crises have not become more severe, there is not an industrial reserve army of paupers, the working class is not increasing at the expense of the self-employed. However, there are deficiencies, particularly inequalities of income and wealth. Does that mean he was wrong? Well, it's a bit like the prophets, like Jonah felt he was wrong, because I prophesied the doom of the destruction didn't happen. Arguably, his dire prophecies stimulated a change from unbridled free market capitalism to social welfare reforms. So in the early part of the 20th century, pensions came in and unemployment and so forth. And the market is controlled. The system survives, but only because government has got more involved. It's not totally unregulated. And this might partly, at least, be down to Marx. So he may have been good for the British economy, arguably. So that's him as an economist and what Marxism is all about. This is, by the way, nothing to do with how communism has turned out in Russia and China and so forth. As I would argue, Paul changing Jesus's Christianity is not, well, he wasn't creating Christianity. Paul created Christianity. Jesus was just a reformed Jew, really. Anyway, it's a different topic. Okay, let me talk about religion, however. What did Marx say about religion? I had some very interesting thoughts. First of all, man makes religion. Religion does not make man. So clearly, he's not saying there is a divine intervention at Sinai where we were given all this stuff. In fact, he's saying that people create God with an independent existence which subordinates humanity to God. So we deliberately put ourselves in a slave-like position. And in fact, their yearning for God means they become alienated from their real existence. Wisdom and love and benevolence are attributes of humans, but they've been projected onto God. And psychologically, that's great for God. It enriches God. We've got this hero, but it diminishes ourselves. It's a bad thing to do to put someone on a pedestal. So what's more, religion preserves inequality and the political and economic status quo. Obviously, perversely enough, Marxism became a religion. So it actually encouraged this autocracy. And initially, he saw religion as the greatest obstacle to human progress. Religion is delusions, and only by abandoning it could people really flourish. So religious suffering is at one and the same time the expression of real suffering and the protest against real suffering. Religion is the sigh of the oppressed creature, the heart of a heartless world, and the soul of a soulless condition. It is the opium of the people. And I guess it's a famous quote, obviously. Opium meaning opium can solve the symptoms, it can get you through the night, but it's not really addressing the cause of the real issue. So it's an illusion that distracts people from what they should really be doing. It allows people to be exploited. Because if you say it's going to be okay in the afterlife, you're not going to do anything about it now. And it deprives them of their autonomy. Means that people don't accept responsibility for their own destiny. The famous joke about, you know, people on the roof of the house and there's a flood, and you know this one about the boats being sent along, right? So Marx wanted humanity to liberate itself from God. And he came to see economic life, not religion, as the chief form of human alienation. He lost interest in analysing religion after a while. But I mentioned this 1843 essay he wrote on the Jewish question, which has had long-standing effects. It was actually trying to criticise. It's the absurd thing he did. It was criticising two studies by a guy called Bruno Bauer, who no one would even know of, apart from if Marx hadn't written this book. because Bauer was didn't want the Jews to achieve political emancipation in Prussia. This is this guy, Bauer. He's probably the source of anti-Semitism, by the way. He argued that Jews could achieve emancipation only if they gave up their Judaism and became Christians, because Christianity was more advanced than Judaism. For Bauer, political emancipation meant a secular state, and that didn't have any room for religious identity. Hence, he justified official bigotry against Jews. Now, actually, Marx agreed with Bauer's anti-Semitism, but he found it offensive to insist that conversion was required, probably because his father had to have it, and he had some ranking against that. And he said that Bauer was wrong that in a secular state, religion could no longer play a prominent role. In America, it did, for example. So Marx focused on political emancipation and equal rights for Jews. But he rejected Judaism's particular cultural identity as being narrow and isolating. So treat the Jews as everyone else, but don't let them be Jewish, was basically his argument. He wanted to break down barriers and integrate everyone. He basically absorbed the prevailing view of the Jew in Germany and France as an object of hatred and contempt, really. So these are just two cartoons from the time. He associated Jews with money and commerce, and he used violent anti-Jewish language to describe Judaism. He basically saw Judaism as the same as capitalism. He was ignorant. My goodness, how many Jews from Eastern Europe had money? None. There were a few rich Jews, but nonetheless, this is what he argued. For him, Jews were the universal antisocial element in society. Judaism was wholly negative, even contemptible. And his solution to the Jewish problem was economic. To make Jews impossible, effectively, it was necessary to abolish the monetary activities which Jews had created. If you abolish the Jewish attitude to money, then Judaism itself would disappear. And you've got, I mean, just to show you how horrible his attitude was, this is a quote from the paper. Let us not look for the secret of the Jew in his religion, but let us look for the secret of his religion in the real Jew. What is the secular basis of Judaism? Practical need, self-interest. What is the worldly religion of the Jew? Huckstering, so bargaining. What is this worldly God? Money. So God, the money is the God of the Jews, is really what he's saying. So that is, he always disliked Judaism. He rejected any form of identification with it. He didn't like his mishpacha and their approach to it at all. And he focused his criticisms on two supposed aspects of Judaism, that is religion and wealth, which didn't apply to him, perhaps to distance himself from his origins and to show that he wasn't involved in Judaism. He made many coarse and vulgar references to Jews. He used anti-Semitic cliches in his letters. For example, he said there's a Jewish nigger, Jews are lepers, horrible things. And I think his legacy has been hugely negative for Jews. He would be, I think, just surprised at all this. He just would be purely pig ignorant about it all. And despite his anti-Judaism, he was often referred to as a Jew, especially by his opponents, and he suffered from anti-Semitism. But his ideas were used strongly in the protocols of the elders of Zion, which has led to lots of problems later on. So, I'm arguing he was bad for the Jews, he didn't do anything about Judaism, but as Michael said, so how can I properly say that he's got Judaism as influence it was about? And you also said this. Well, Isaiah Berlin, who you might have heard of, a Russian-British philosopher, thought that Marx's passionate advocacy for the proletariat was explicitly due to his Jewish background. It is this is a quote, "It is the oppression of centuries of a people of pariahs, not of a recently risen class, that is speaking to him." As we know, biblical prophets were alienated, misunderstood men. They were driven by an inner compulsion. And in their own lifetime, they only had a few, if any, disciples. Marx had many similar characteristics to the prophets. Here's just 5 of them, really. So, prophets and demagogues, this emotional invective against political overlords and false prophets. They fought for freedom from oppression. They spoke for the exploited in society. They attacked the use of religion, actually, and religious ritual as substitutes for social justice. "What do my fast mean for me?" said Isaiah. They both denounced social corruption and the abuse of power. And they both predicted doom and destruction for certain sectors of society. So I think that many of Marx's ideas and approaches can be explicitly found within Judaism. The issues he raised are universal. It's just that Judaism's got a different resolution of them sometimes. And I've just got a few to show to you. So clearly the law is important in both of them. In fact, in a very similar way. In Marxism, society is governed by an iron economic laws written in a holy text, which is called Das Kapital. We've got Torah for our iron unenforceable text. It's the same philosophy behind it. On social justice, in Marxism, workers are a commodity within capitalism. Greed and competition and private property controls economics and leads to alienation. And socialism champions the oppressed and liberates workers. What have we got in Judaism? Well, the prophetic teachings are all about protecting the weak and the vulnerable and tikkun olam, improving the world. People are equal as a matter of right within Judaism, not as a matter of grace. So there's similar values behind it. And I think alienation, which is so important within Marxism, so the estrangement of people from their existence as they're dominated, he calls this commodity fetishism, which means materialism, really. So that they're sucked into things, which also Judaism would oppose, but also I think particularly our alienation is from God. So we've got through idol worship and materialism, that's the distance which Judaism is forever trying to narrow, I think. Just a couple more. The ideal social, or the goal of society, really. So within Marxism, the idea is communism. Capitalism is a necessary evil on the inevitable historical journey to the paradise of communism. So greed and egotism and envy will disappear once private property is replaced with communal property. And communism is going to lead to new ethical basis for society. There's that famous quote, the most famous quote from Marx, maybe, from each according to his ability to each according to his needs. So that's what's going to come. And what would be the equivalent for Judaism? What am I going to put in that?
Kibbutz.
A kibbutz. But what's within Judaism itself? What's the sort of religious equivalent? Well, you could argue it's going to be the Messianic age. That's what it's all about. That's what we're striving to achieve. Moral perfection in this world, not the afterlife. I think that's the difference between, say, Judaism and Christianity. We've got to improve this world exactly as Marx would want to do. And then finally, a controversial one maybe to end on. So, free will, the whole idea of free will. For Marx, it's clear, the aim of human history is freedom. Human beings cannot be free if they are subject to forces that determine their thoughts, their ideas, and their nature as human beings. So this was a crucial value for him. So within Judaism, I don't know what you think, we are morally free, we're given free will. Our choices are not predetermined. Within an orthodox situation, does halakha really give us free will? We've got the free will to decide whether to keep it or not. maybe progressive Judaism is more genuinely giving free will about how to be and so forth. So maybe progressive Judaism is closer to Marxism than orthodoxy.